Hello everybody, I wanted to follow up on my last video discussing part 3 and how there's a pattern emerging before that part and then into that one regarding issues of communication and language and Tolstoy's skepticism concerning language. And we see that in part in the scene with Kitty and Dolly in part 2 when they're coming to terms regarding the jilting that Kitty experienced at the hands of Vronsky, and where their reconciliation at the end of that conversation comes largely non-verbally, and when they're trying to talk, they actually end up insulting or hurting each other. And then we see a similar pattern emerging when Kuznetsov visits Levin in the country, and he's very invested in trying to talk about the countryside and the peasantry, whereas Levin is much more interested in just losing himself in his experience of those things, in the estate, in the mowing scene, in the beauty of nature, but doesn't really want to talk about them, doesn't want to discuss them. There's something about talking about these things that contaminates them or gets them wrong or doesn't quite capture what they're like. And then we see that same pattern repeated in a couple of moments later in part 3. In the last chapter of part 3, chapter 32, we actually see Nikolai, Levin's other brother, visiting, and he's very sick. And we see that they actually both know on some gut level what's going on, that Nikolai is dying. And Konstantin Levin wants to say that aloud. He wants to say, "You're dying." And we're told that Nikolai kind of wants to accept that fact and confess that he's afraid, but that neither of them does these things. And instead, they just end up talking around the subject. They don't face up to it, and they're therefore being dishonest with each other and faking things the whole time. And they perceive that fakeness in one another, and it makes them miserable and angry, and it's not good. And then there's another scene in part 4, the remarkable scene where Levin and Kitty reconcile, and actually where Levin proposes to Kitty. Um, and I would invite you to look at that scene. I'm not going to examine it closely, um, but it really is astounding. It's surprising in the way that it takes place. Just all this writing on the chalkboard and deciphering what the other means. The one other thing I wanted to draw your attention to in part 4 that might be worth your thinking about is the way that Stiva throws a dinner party, and the way that Stiva and Dolly serve as this link between the two parts of the plot that we read so far, Levin's and Anna's.